Hello, hello, hello! In this lesson, we're going to learn about classes. Now, this is something that I know a lot of JavaScript developers do not know about. And this is one of those things that makes JavaScript extremely powerful. And this is true object-oriented programming. Now, once you get your head around how object-oriented programming really works and the power behind it and why you should do it versus why you should do method or function-based views instead of writing entire classes, you'll start to realize that libraries like React, Angular, jQuery are not really all that difficult. It's just a lot of logic. Well, that and a lot of spinning pieces. So, it takes a lot of people to build these things. I'm not trying to downplay React or Angular or jQuery or anything like that. I just want to let you know that when you learn about classes and it starts to come together for you, that as a JavaScript developer, your world all of a sudden goes from being way too big to being just the right size. And now all of a sudden you'll be able to contribute to larger projects. You'll be able to contribute to React or Angular or any open source projects or write your own code and do some really amazing things. But before we can do that, we need to see what a class looks like. So let's go ahead and declare our first class. Class, animal. And it looks like this. There are no parentheses. There's no colon. It does break some of the rules that we have learned before, but it's also in the name of containment. We want to contain similar pieces of data and functionality into one class. As an example, let's say constructor name. So now we have a class and we have a constructor. What does a constructor do? As of right now, you don't know that it does anything. So let's put this into perspective. To create a class, it's just that. That's all it is. To what's called instantiate, or init, to initialize, or to create, or you can use whatever word you want, but to basically get this class up and running, because just like a function, JavaScript realizes that, hey, I do have code here, but I'm not going to run it yet. You have to what's called instantiate it, or initialize it. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call this dog. How we do this by writing new animal. Now we can do this with functions too, and we can make functions basically turn into entire classes, which is great, and that's how we got to use the this keyword. I'm doing air quotes here. This keyword. However, the this keyword is actually more applicable to an entire class than it is to just one particular function. Now the reason for that is because a class is basically a container for all similar functions. Any function that has to do with this animal, whatever that animal might be, is going to go in there. So now we have functions inside of a container. We can have variables inside of this container, and they can all work together. So it's a way for you to compartmentalize a large piece of your code into a smaller, more manageable section. So here we have dog is equal to new animal. And as soon as a class is run, it's going to run this constructor function. Now, this function does not start with the word function. And you can see that my editor here, Sublime, did not highlight the word function as it usually does. For example, function, it usually looks like this. It doesn't. So get rid of that. You can put your parameters in there. You can put as many parameters or arguments, whatever you want to call them, you can put them in there. We're just going to go with dog. So I have a new dog, and his name is Joey. Now what happens when I console log dog? I'm going to save. So hit refresh, and here we go. We have an animal, and that's about it. Now, why is the name not in there? Well, because even though we specified a name, and it's being run in here, like I can show you that it's being run in here, console.log name, refresh the page, and we get Joey. But it's not in our object. Remember, this is an object-oriented programming language. That means that our class is also an object, and there's no name in here. So when we're dealing with classes, what we want to do is we type this. Remember the this keyword again, doing air quotes here. This.name is equal to name. And at this point, we can add filters, we can lowercase, we can uppercase, we do whatever we want to this name. Now when I save and refresh, here we go, we have name is in there. Now it doesn't just have to take a parameter that you gave it or that you passed through in the constructor. You could also say this dot height, for example, is, let's say 32, and we're just assuming inches here, right? Refresh the page. Here we go. We have height and we have name. So that was an example that height was not passed through here. It was just an automatic assignment. So great. Okay, so what can we do with this? Because although we have a construction, we can pass information to it. Honestly, this is not useful in any application. This is just a variable holding a bunch of information that we cannot access yet. Remember, a variable that we can access is inside the scope. A variable that we cannot access is outside of our scope. Well, unfortunately, these are inside of our animal scope, which is in here, but we still don't have access to it really in here. Not yet. To do that, we can simply type console.log dog.name. And there we have Joey. I can do the same thing with the height. Now, if you're thinking, wow, Caleb, this looks a lot like a regular object. Why on earth wouldn't I just use a regular object? And a regular object, just as a refresher, being something along these lines, where you have name is equal to something and height is equal to 32, right? We could grab the same thing, object.name, actually, because the values don't match up. Object is the same as dog.height. Right, so we've got this object.height is equal to dog, well, this is actually supposed to be down here, technically, for that to work. Dog, which has all of this code in here in one single line. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove that. So if you're asking me, Caleb, why am I not just using a regular object data type versus using a class? Well, there are several answers for that. One, JavaScript is a relatively new language. It's only 20-ish years old. Two, because of that, it has gone through a lot of evolution and is trying to catch up. But a better answer for why you would use a class instead of an object is because your class can have tons of objects inside of objects. Now, your objects can also have that. Your object data type can have objects inside of objects, can have lists, and it can have all that stuff. It can even have functions in there. And we know that it can manipulate a lot of its own data using the this keyword. So why use a class? Well, the benefit to a class, again, is containment. So you can have one big file. It might not actually be big, but you can have one file, and it could just be called animal.js. And that contains all the code for an animal. Now, instead of having one massive JavaScript file that's hundreds of kilobytes long, I mean, that's a pretty big JavaScript file, you can have one that's maybe 2 kilobytes and only contains this information. Now, by separating that code, by making it a little more modular, you're able to maintain it easier. Now, if that wasn't a selling point for you, and I remember being a new dev and thinking, well, that's not a selling point for me. Like, I don't care. I'll just use objects, like object data types. To learn about classes and the functions and properties, methods, and all that stuff inside of them is, again, a transferable skill. So even if you only use data types, the object data type in JavaScript, that's great. You can transfer that to a lot of other languages, but classes pretty much directly transfer to PHP, to Python, to whatever other OOP language you can think of. So by getting a grip on this in JavaScript, you are actually learning the fundamental concept of object-oriented programming in other languages. So when you go to pick up Python in the future, which I highly advise, you are already familiar with what they call class-based views, or just classes in general and how they inherit each other. And so that brings me to my next point. An object cannot inherit another object, but classes can inherit classes. And we're going to get to that. It might be in 1 or 2 more videos, depending on how long this one goes. I don't want this one to go for too long because classes, it's a very, very, very big subject. Thankfully, you know everything that needs to go into it already. So let's continue, Caleb. You're talking far too much and not typing enough. So this is a function. Inside of a class, we don't call this a function. No, sir. Inside of a class, we call this a method. Why? Well, does it say function in front of it? Nope. And now the reason for that is because we can actually call this. I'm going to demonstrate that in a little bit, but we can call it off of dog, or whatever we name that variable. This is a variable. However, because it's inside of a class, it's not a variable. Technically, in object-oriented programming, it's called a property. Now, why is that? Well, because the property doesn't leave the class, technically. You can access it by instantiating the class, but you cannot actually access it from outside. So if I wanted to, I couldn't just type animal.name because the name has not been set yet, so this .name does not exist. So I'm just leave a note here. This is called a method, and this is called a property. And I'm just going to get rid of inches because that's really unimportant to this lesson. So now we have a constructor, and all this does is set us up with the name Joey. What does an animal do? It makes a sound, okay? So let's make, no, remember, no function. That's just a bad habit. Let's call this function speak. And by default, what is this going to do? All it's going to do is console.log woof. In fact, actually, let's make this a tad bit more complicated. This dot species is dog, but instead, let's make that dynamic. And instead of having it dog, let's call it species dot to lowercase, i.e. dog. And we're just going to add that back in here, dog, and his name is Joey, and his height is automatically set. And by default, when he speaks, he makes a woof. So, to call this function, we type dog.speak. Just like how we did dog.name, and this console logged back to us Joey, because that's what we named him, this is going to say run the function, or run the method inside of this class, and console log woof. So when we save and refresh, woof, there we go. And every time I refresh, it says woof. Cool, so now we're running functions with just one line of code. And now that function is exclusive to this animal, and because of that, it's no longer called a function. Its exclusivity makes it a method. Now, what if we wanted to change the name? Let's say we went and adopted an animal from one of those pet shelters. It had a terrible name, or maybe didn't have a name, and we wanted to rename him. We could create another method called rename animal. And what do we want to rename it? Whatever the name is. And in here, all we do is say this.name is equal to name. Now, to explain the this, what this means is this. Notice how I only selected the class. I didn't select anything outside of it. I only selected this class. So you can think of it, if you're a little more familiar with scopes now, you know, we have var name, we have var height, var species. These are the three variables, right? We have species, name, height, there we are. Not in the right order, but the order doesn't matter. But the difference is we don't declare them in here. We don't have variables just running around out in the open. We have variables that are contained using this keyword. And what this does is, instead of using the word this outside of it, outside of this class, this becomes dog, or whatever you name your variable. So this.name would be essentially the same thing as dog.name. So let's go ahead and dog.rename animal. And we don't want him to be named Joey anymore. Let's name him Ross. And just to prove how this is working, console log the entire dog object, refresh our page, unexpected identifier, line 3. That's because I forgot to get rid of these. Remember, variables are not allowed to run around wildly inside of a class. Refresh, he woofs. The species is dog, the name is Ross, and his height is 32. And just like before, when we were doing this with functions, his name was originally Joey, and now you can see that his name is Ross. So this is a basic introduction into JavaScript classes and object-oriented programming, real deep object-oriented programming.